Hello everyone, this is Jason from Primetime Aquatics, and as some of you know, we have a lot of shell dwellers in our fish room, and I wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about how to set up a shell dweller tank. I also want to highlight the shell dwellers that we have in our fish room. We've got five, well, kind of like 5.5 species of shell dwellers, so stay tuned. So we get a lot of questions about our shell dwellers, and we have a number of them in our fish room. We have Neolamprologus multifasciatus, we've got the gold ocellatus or Lamprologus ocellatus, we've got Neolamprologus meleagris, Neolamprologus brevis, Neolamprologus similis, and we actually have one that's kind of a shell dweller and kind of not, and that is our Calypterus. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time today talking about how do we set up a shell dweller tank, because they're really, really cool. These shell dwellers generally stay pretty small. Sometimes they're good for a smaller tank, a 10-gallon or a 20-gallon, and they have a ton of personality, but there are some things we need to know about them, generally speaking, that will help us be successful. So I think the first thing we need to understand is they are cichlids, and so because they're cichlids, they're going to have some personality to them. They might be a little bit aggressive at times, although their aggression tends to be a little bit less so than maybe what we would see with some of the other cichlids. The other thing is that most shell dwellers come from Lake Tanganyika. Yes, there are some shell dwellers from other lakes, but the vast majority of them come from Lake Tanganyika, and being so, they enjoy water parameters that are typical of cichlids. And so Lake Tanganyika fish generally like a high pH, somewhere in that 8 to 8.2 range, maybe even a little bit higher. Water hardness, they like hard water. And so in our fish room, we generally have water that is somewhere around 180 parts per million, both in general hardness and carbonate hardness, and that's been working out very, very well for us. Temperatures, your typical tropical fish temperatures, somewhere around that 78 degrees or so. We tend to keep all of our shell dwellers somewhere between 78 and 80 degrees, and they've been enjoying that quite a bit. Now, when it comes to how we set up the tank, if you've got your water parameters in check, I think tank setup is relatively easy for a Lake Tanganyikan fish. So if you have a natural water source that is maybe not quite as hard as we need, or the pH is a little bit too low, there are things that you can do to increase the pH and increase the water hardness. I've talked about that before. I will put a card in the upper right hand corner where we talk about water hardness. But one of the things that you can do is you can add a little bit of crushed coral to your substrate. It works even better if you add the crushed coral to your filter. Put that in a filter bag. That will certainly help increase water hardness. And we want that pH to be a little bit higher to keep them at their happiest. Now, at least for us, for the most part, I really like keeping our Lake Tanganyikan shell dwellers with other Lake Tanganyikan fish, again, because they enjoy the same water parameters, and I just really like that look. So a lot of our Lake Tanganyikans are in Lake Tanganyikan setups, and some of them are in species-only tanks, especially if we want to breed them. Now, there's a lot of variety when it comes to their personalities. We really like our Neolamprologus multifasciatus tank, or otherwise known as Maltese. They are in a 50-gallon lowboy, and that is a really cool tank. It's 4 feet long by 2 feet wide, and it's only 10 inches tall. It gives them a lot of area to grow. What's really cool about the Maltese is they don't really prey on their fry, and so you'll see little pockets of fry everywhere. Now, we've done a much more detailed look at Neolamprologus multifasciatus, or our multi-shell dwellers. I will put that card in the upper right hand corner. If you're interested in learning a lot more about that specific fish, check that video out. It's a very old video that we did, but the information is still quite good. So Maltese are awesome. They tend not to be super aggressive. That is a shell dweller, or maybe we could keep that in a smaller tank. Maybe a pair in a 10-gallon, but I prefer to do a 20-gallon. Certainly a 20 long would be pretty awesome. The other fish that's very similar to it is Neolamprologus similis. We only have one similis in our fish room right now, and that's in a 20-gallon. It's actually in a 20-gallon planted tank, and the reason why we did that is I really wanted to keep that fish away from our Maltese because they look so similar. There's a chance for hybridization. I would like to get more, and once I do, I will set those fish up in a Lake Tanganyikan setup. Neolamprologus brevis, really cool fish. So it's got a silver appearance, and it's got more like a bulldog face. They tend to be a little bit more aggressive than the similis and the Maltese, but they're really super awesome. The meleagris that we're keeping, that is I would say more of a rare type of shell dweller. I don't see them around as much. They get a little bit larger than the Maltese, the Similis, and the Brevis, but their coloration is really cool because they've got that nice marbly look to them. We've had some success breeding them, but part of the problem is they're in there with Calvis and some feather fins, and so I think a lot of their fry are getting picked off, but they're relatively easy to breed. I would say of the shell dwellers that we keep, probably the most aggressive one that we have are the gold ocellatus. They're in a 20 long, and unless we remove the fry, we don't get a lot of fry that survive in that tank. Ideally, if you were trying to breed those, you'd probably just keep a pair in a 20 long, and as they're breeding and as the fry are growing out, you would remove them. This setup that we have here, like I said, it's not ideal, but it works as long as we pull the fry out relatively quickly. The gold ocellatus tend to get a little bit bigger, and they are extremely feisty. In fact, we did a species profile on these. If you want a lot more information about them, I will put that card in the upper right-hand corner. Very cool fish, very beautiful, that nice deep gold color, a little bit of purple, but they're the type of fish where even when we're putting our hands in the tank to clean the sponge filters or move rocks around, if they've got fry in the tank, they will all out attack your hand. So they've got a little bit more of an edge to them and would probably enjoy a larger tank than some of the other shell dwellers that we've talked about so far. Now, one of the other shell dwellers that we have, technically speaking, it's sort of a shell dweller because the females, our Calypterus females, they like to be inside the shells. The babies are in there, and that's how they raise them. The males are too big, and so the males can get actually quite large at 4 or 5 inches, maybe even larger. But the colors on the males are absolutely beautiful, as you can see, with the nice blue lips. The females tend to stay a little bit more marbled, especially if they are protecting fry. What's interesting about the Calypterus is they will take shells, the main male, the alpha male will take all the shells and pile them up, and they all become his. So we've got our Calypterus in a 33 long. It's a great fish. Again, it's kind of a shell dweller because of what the females do, but maybe not as similar as what we're seeing here with the other ones. Okay. So now that we've kind of gone through the overview of the shell dwellers that we have, and there are others, but these are just the ones that we have, how do we want to set up the tank? So I think as you're watching the video, you can see the first thing is sand. And it doesn't necessarily matter what type of sand you use. In fact, in the tanks that we're looking at, some of our shell dweller tanks have pool filter sand. Other tanks have Nat Geo sand, and some of the other tanks, I believe, have Carib Sea cichlid sand. The main thing here is if you have generally soft water, some of those cichlid mixes might help buffer your tank with a little bit higher pH, release some minerals to get the hardness up in the water as well. So sand to me is a must because most shell dwellers are going to dig through the sand. They're going to bury shells. They might bury each other's shells. And so that is a major part of their personality. And without the sand, you're going to be missing that. And so I highly recommend a sand-only tank for your shell dwellers. Now, of course, the other thing that you're going to need are shells. And you can see in all of our shell dwelling tanks, we've got shells. They're escargot shells that we actually buy from Amazon, really super cheap. I will put an Amazon affiliate link to that in the description below, and I'll hopefully try to remember to pin a comment in there as well. But that is a great way to save a lot of money. You can get them at like 24 to a pack, and they're next to nothing, and they work wonderfully. We just kind of rinse them out before we throw them in the tank, and the fish, as you can see, they really enjoy them. The other thing that we'll sometimes do is add rock features. In fact, in pretty much every shell dweller tank that you see, there are some rocks that are kind of in the background, makes the tank look a little bit nicer. We've had really good luck with the coral. We've had really good luck with flagstone, and so you'll see that piled up in a lot of our tanks. But I like that look. I like to have some type of a, whether it's Texas Holy Rock, so some type of a rock feature in the tank, more for looks than for anything else, because the fish themselves really like to hang out in the shells. So if you've got your sand, you've got your shells, and you've got some kind of rock feature that you enjoy, that's really the basics. Are you going to need a heater? Yes, because you're going to want that tank up to 78 to 80 degrees. How about plants? Well, plants are interesting. You could potentially use some floating plants, and at one point we had a lot of floating hornwort in our multi-tank. It looked really, really cool. It kind of died back, and I removed some of it because it was really starting to overgrow in some areas, then eventually it all kind of died out. But floating plants might work. You can see in a couple of the tanks we actually have some jungle val that's growing, but the thing with the shell dwellers, once again, is they're really going to want it manipulate their environment. They're going to want to build up, mounds of sand everywhere and mountains of sand. And that's what's so cool about them. So if you're trying to plant plants in the sand, they might just go ahead and dig them out. So plants may not work. We've had, like I said, some limited success with jungle valves. Floating plants like hornwort have worked. And we've found feeding them is very, very simple. So they will eat most crushed flake food, or whether that's just your simple tropical fish flakes or cichlid flakes. They do tend to like bloodworms, although we tend to make the bloodworms a little bit smaller for them because they're kind of tiny fish, usually topping out somewhere around that 1 or 2 inch range, depending on the type, depending on whether or not they're male or female. So we use bloodworms sparingly. They like frozen brine shrimp. I love to feed our shell dwellers live baby brine. One, because you never know if they've got babies in the shells, and so that can help. But I've also found that even the adults really, really, really love live baby brine. And so we actually feed it out to all of our shell dwellers twice a day. Not necessary to do. Again, it's just something that we really like to do. So flakes, micro pellets, frozen brine shrimp, frozen bloodworms, live baby brine are all wonderful things to feed your shell-dwelling cichlids. And again, these are great fish with a fantastic personality. They don't need a huge tank, but the larger you go, the more area that you have on the bottom, the larger the colony that you can have, and you can start to see a lot of their dynamics, and it's really cool. So if you've got a chance to check them out, I would highly recommend it. They can get a little pricey, especially if they're not common in your area. I've seen some of the shell dwellers go for $20, $30 or more per fish, but they're really cool. Try them out if you get a chance. So if you like this video, share, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.